Thanks. I'm really happy to have the opportunity to be here today at Canada's first National Phragmites Conference. I am also glad to follow Erica, who spoke about the Great Lakes Phragmites Collaborative, which is something that I worked on for a number of years. And then, of course, to follow Cliff. And I thank Cliff for his words and his engagement as a federal employee of the Canadian Wildlife Service. We have a responsibility to work with our First Nations communities. And as I work on Phragmites in Ontario, I do hope to expand our relationships and our opportunities to work with communities throughout Ontario. So today I will be talking about a pilot program that was initiated in Ontario several years ago. It is a large-scale management of invasive Phragmites in the Long Point region of Ontario, and just tell the story about this program, the risks involved, rewards, and some lessons learned. And we had a lot of challenges associated with this project, but really a lot of great outcomes that have been measured and assessed, that are opportunities to share with other people, to bring together in sort of a collaborative fashion, like Erica mentioned earlier. So a lot of collaboration has occurred on the US side of the border, and Ontario has been engaged in that to some extent. But at the end of the day, I would like to sort of push for a call for greater collaboration on Phragmites management and habitat restoration throughout Canada. So just a bit of background on the Long Point Phragmites pilot program. I'm speaking as a representative of the Canadian Wildlife Service, but the partnership that initiated this work is a large group, much larger than just one federal agency. This work was really spearheaded by organizations like the Nature Conservancy, the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry in Ontario, which now has a different name, Ontario Parks, as well as a host of other local landowners and agencies and organizations in the Long Point region, who recognized a need to address the issue of Phragmites. So just to get you situated a little bit, so we all know the approximate area that we're talking about, the Long Point region of Ontario sits on the north shore of Lake Erie. It juts out into Lake Erie for about 40 or 42 kilometers, and it's a dynamic sand spit shaped by what is occurring in Lake Erie. It has a pedigree of international recognition. It's a biosphere reserve, a Ramsar wetland, international important breeding, birding area, etc. It's Canada's, the CWS's designated priority place for the province of Ontario. And as you can see in red on this map, there are two national wildlife areas in sort of 4 units that make up a large part of the spit of Long Point. And in between the federal lands are lands owned by other conservation landowners like the province of Ontario and Ontario Parks, the Nature Conservancy, Birds Canada. There's also a large and historic hunting club in there as well. So basically, there's a lot of people who care about conservation in this area. Lots of very engaged landowners, and different objectives for wanting to manage Phragmites. This is also an area of very high biodiversity, and we have more than 80 species at risk throughout this area. So here's a few of those species here. We have all the turtles, birds, snakes, frogs, toads, etc. And this is an aerial shot toward the tip of the Long Point Peninsula. It doesn't really look like maybe what you think of when you think of Lake Erie. And this is truly just a very special area of Canada and of the world. Erica did a great job of talking about what Phragmites is. And I assume most people on the phone also are familiar with Phragmites. In Long Point, we grow frag to be super, super strong and dense. We know that frag in Long Point will grow up to 6 meters in height. So that is the height of a 2-story house. And we'll get densities of up to 200 stems per meter square. Of course, the below ground biomass is something that is a major concern. And there's an image here of what those very large and extensive root and rhizome systems look like. And then on the right, that's an aerial view of part of the Long Point area. And in the light green, you will see Phragmites. And so in this region, man, we just had hundreds and hundreds of hectares of Phragmites that had expanded throughout this really significant and ecologically diverse area. Just as an example of this rate of spread, you'll see here, this is the Big Creek Unit at the National Wildlife Area, which is sort of at the landmost side of Long Point. In 2006, we mapped approximately 5 hectares of Phragmites, but by 2015, we had over 176 hectares. And so Phragmites had then expanded to cover more than 27% of that unit of the National Wildlife Area. Overall, in this region of Long Point in 2015, we estimated that there were over 1,300 hectares. And so for the partners in this area, we were dealing with a extremely large issue. And coupled with that, we had the presence of many federally and provincially listed species at risk that also have critical habitat designations throughout this area. So a little bit of a conflict. We have areas that are conserved to protect species at risk that are also being impacted by an invasive species. So we knew how to manage Phragmites and these very large scale infestations of Phragmites based on best management practices developed in the US. A couple of my favorite guides are up here. This a guide to the control and management of invasive Phragmites came out of the state of Michigan, and it was based on research that was initiated in the early 2000s. So there's a long history of Phragmites management in the U.S. There are multiple ways to manage Phragmites, but for stands on the scale that are at Long Point, the appropriate best management practice is the use of herbicide, generally glyphosate as a first order of operations, followed by management in the winter to remove the vegetation that was killed by the herbicide, and then coming back the following fall and looking for any areas to retreat, because Phragmites is incessant and it continues to come back. And if you fail to retreat, your problem is just going to be right back on your doorstep again. And one of the most important things that I think sometimes historically has been lacking is ecological monitoring. And I think for that reason, sometimes we haven't always known whether our projects are successful. And what is success? What are our objectives when we do manage? It's not just about killing Phragmites. It's about reestablishing conditions that we want by virtue of removing the Phragmites. There's also a resource in Ontario that's been mentioned. It's been updated just in the last year, and it is the Best Management Practices Guidebook for Phragmites. And the Great Lakes Phragmites Collaborative, as Erica mentioned, is just filled with all sorts of resources, and that website greatlakesphragmites.net was really established to be a one-stop site for everything related to Phragmites. But in Canada, of course, we didn't have the same opportunities to use herbicides as freely as they could be used in the US. Um, Herbicides were not registered. There were not registered herbicides for use in Canada. So glyphosate or Roundup is used commonly in the US. It can be used in terrestrial areas of Canada, but it was not registered for use in wetlands. And this really, coupled with low water levels in the Great Lakes, this inability to manage Phragmites over the last 20 years has contributed to its spread throughout Ontario. In addition to not being registered, we didn't even have herbicides we could buy here in Canada. Um, we have never implemented this best management practice in Canada, and so while there was lots of evidence and research coming out of the States, the fact that this process had never been implemented in Canada was really a bit of a stumbling block. There just wasn't trust, or there wasn't trust in the process. Um, in addition, all the landowners in the Long Point region had a bit of a challenge because there were just lots of administrative or policy hoops to jump through with association with the presence of species at risk, different permits that needed to be applied for, um, engagement with the public, uh, concerns over the idea of putting herbicides in water and what impacts could there be on safety for aquatic wildlife or even for drinking water. Um, if we were to implement a best management practice like this, we didn't have a lot of contractors to work with since no one had done this work. So that was also a challenge. And then at Long Point, there are no roads that go through the end of Long Point. It is extremely remote with lots of sensitive habitats. And then I just got an email this morning reminding me about the class action lawsuit about glyphosate. So there just were a lot of challenges with the optics of using herbicides. And as someone who worked in the US for 20 years, it's just a very different approach in the US. The herbicides are used much more freely. And in Canada, there's a lot of speculation and concern about health. So we had a lot of challenges facing us, but at the same time, we were watching species at risk being impacted negatively, being threatened um, by this encroaching Phragmites. Um, Species at risk were being found dead and dried up in stands of Phragmites. Turtles that would normally move through certain areas were now not able to access areas for breeding because this dense wall of Phragmites was there. We're seeing declines in for aerial foraging species, etc. And so in about 2015, several partners, including Nature Conservancy Canada and the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, elicited a call to action. And so they brought together a large group of partners to tell the story about Phragmites and its impacts in the area, and to move the opportunity to manage Phragmites forward. And so they developed a lot of community support, and they had everyone in the Long Point area on board with the need to manage Phragmites. They contacted the manufacturer of Roundup directly and talked to them about maybe having a pilot program in Ontario where the the benefits, the value of the herbicide product could be used, and the impacts would be measured and tested. They subsequently applied to get that herbicide project registered in an emergency registration, and that goes through Health Canada's Pest Management Regulatory Agency. And in that application, we partners need to demonstrate the safety of that herbicide and get approvals and letters of support. Um, and then that herbicide could be allowed for use in aquatic areas in a certain formulation within a specific area. They applied for lots of permits. They initiated extensive, rigorous ecological monitoring with the University of Waterloo. And ultimately, they found trained biologists and as to work as contractors to implement this important work. And so in 2016, really, the Phragmites Management Pilot Project was initiated. And the purpose was to contribute to the recovery of wetlands, wildlife, and species at risk by managing 90% of the Phragmites in the Long Point region. And that number 90% is important because um, we know that complete eradication of Phragmites is not possible. And so we wanted to pick a number that was manageable and that we would be able to continue to address long term. We also wanted to monitor and evaluate the impacts of Phragmites, both on Phragmites and on the subsequent restoration or recovery of habitat for wildlife. And we wanted to support the implementation of the Pan-Canadian Framework for Species at Risk Conservation. And this is sort of the federal aspect of this work. I'll talk a little bit more about that later because initially, Environment Canada and the Canadian Wildlife Service were not active implementers in this program. We were funders, but the initial work began on that provincial land and private lands across the Long Point area. Most importantly, or one of the most important elements of this program was also the encouragement of collaborative actions. And so while there wasn't a structured form of collaboration like you'll see in collective impact, this was a regional effort that required buy-in from a lot of people. Um, the uh, engagement, the achievement of multiple objectives coming together for in um, one main project. And so this this working with your neighbors and encouraging collaboration is something that's really important and is sort of one of the lessons learned from the program is that those are really important things associated with Phragmites management programs. And so with the emergency registration of the herbicide Roundup Custom, which was specially formulated for use in Canada. Often when you buy Roundup in the US, it will come pre-mixed with a surfactant, which is an adjuvant that helps the herbicide stick to the plant leaves. And in many cases, those surfactants are not safe for aquatic life. So the herbicide that we procured, Roundup Custom, um, is just an herbicide alone, and it had to be mixed with a water-safe surfactant, which is called Aquasurf and is produced in Canada. So we had so much area to treat. We initiated that best management practice, starting with aerial herbicide application, as well as ground herbicide application using a Marshmaster, which is in the first and second image here. It's this large track vehicle. It's made of aluminum, so it's actually extremely light, a lot lighter than it looks, and it can also float to some extent on water, so super helpful in wetland areas. We Also then followed up during the winter to mechanically manage and reduce standing dead. We know that after treatment with glyphosate, Phragmites can remain standing for 5 to 6 years. And so it's really important to try to remove that biomass in one way or another. And this image, the second image, shows a marsh master affixed with a rolling implement to knock down the Phragmites. Sometimes marsh masters have a cutter blade on them. Um, Sometimes in smaller stands, you can use like a weed whipper sort of implement. Um, Alternatively, in certain instances, prescribed burns were used. This removal of the standing dead not only knocks down the vegetation, but it also creates conditions where new vegetation can grow without being overshadowed by that dense now dead Phragmites. And then when you think about follow-up treatment the following year, it's a lot easier to spot any reestablished or untreated Phragmites when you're not dealing with a wall of dead Phragmites that's 6 meters tall. And then the province and its partners also initiated ecological monitoring with the University of Waterloo before, during, and after this work. So between 2016 and 2019, approximately 1,100 hectares of Phragmites was treated in the Long Point region. Importantly, our research demonstrated that there was 97% or greater efficacy. And so we knew that the application of the herbicide followed by the winter management was successfully killing Phragmites. And that was really one major thing we needed to demonstrate. Um, what you'll see on this map is red areas. Red areas are the treated areas of Phragmites. The yellow areas are the untreated areas, which not surprisingly line up with the federal national wildlife areas. And this image on your left, the aerial, shows the border. The left-hand side of the image is provincial crown land, or it's actually provincial park. There's a strip in the middle, and then on the right-hand side with all that light green, that is a national wildlife area, part of Long Point National Wildlife Area. And you can imagine that if the Canadian Wildlife Service didn't take action, um, what would be happening next is um, the spread of Phragmites from those national wildlife areas back on to this area that had been treated. And so there was a lot of pressure on the Canadian Wildlife Service to jump in. And so ultimately, we were able to do that. I was hired in 2018, and this became my primary project. And so with the Canadian Wildlife Service, as I mentioned, we have a few different rules from what the provincial and nonprofit partners had, because the national wildlife areas are established to protect and recover those species at risk. And there are just so many of them that we knew Phragmites was impacting habitat, but we really needed to be careful that in the management of Phragmites, we weren't somehow impacting individuals. And so in an area as vast as Long Point, that becomes really different to manage. And so, excuse me, we needed to be very conservative and take a very detailed and thoughtful approach. So internally within the Canadian Wildlife Service, there were a lot of concerns about using an herbicide in a wetland area. And my colleague from Eric Cleland from the Nature Conservancy, he and I attended meetings where, the majority of our research came from the US, and somehow that research is never as good as work that's occurred in Canada. And so the fact that Waterloo had been conducting research for a few years meant that gradually we were able to show that in Ontario, on lands adjacent to the national wildlife areas, we had safe application of herbicide, no negative impacts to non-target species, um, and 97% effectiveness of using the herbicide. What we didn't see immediately was the recovery of native species, and that was due to the high water levels that were occurring in the area, and so that was a bit of a buzzkill, for some of our managers who wanted to see, um, a rebound instantly, but eventually it came, and in order for the Canadian Wildlife Service to jump in, we adapted our monitoring protocol to include some specific monitoring on species at risk. And so we started our work at a very small scale in 2019 and ramped up in 2020. Our ecological monitoring was very similar to what the province and Nature Conservancy had worked on with the University of Waterloo. But in addition, we were also mapping habitat features for species at risk. And where we could find them, we were also mapping specific species at risk plants. And the purpose, of course, was to be able to monitor how those species were recovering after herbicide treatment, but also to be sure that we would avoid treating those areas when we did the Phragmites management. We were looking at the efficacy of the approach as well as looking at the effects of the herbicide on vegetation to see if there were non-target impacts. We're evaluating vegetation recovery. We're looking at water and sediment to look at um, what uh, what is the risk of the use of the surfactant and the herbicide in water and sediment. And this is again something that hasn't been done a lot before. And I know Courtney is going to touch on this a little bit in her presentation that's up next. But it's this using safety of using the herbicide and whether it does have any impacts to aquatic ecology. We're also assessing the effects of the treatment on wetland biota. So birds, fish, turtles. We're doing turtle telemetry um, to be sure that we know what is happening for species at risk as a result of management. And then we're also using high resolution satellite imagery through our science and technology branch to assess changes in fish habitat. And we did require a Fisheries Act authorization for this permit for this project. So in addition to the general Canadian Wildlife Service wildlife stuff, we also have an obligation to quantify impacts to fish and species at risk fish. Just in terms of what we have done to date, through 2019 to 2021, the Canadian Wildlife Service has treated about 150 hectares. These are 2 units of the Big Creek National Wildlife Area. These are sort of closest to the mainland, and that's a lot of Phragmites in there, except for a few areas where we have control and reference locations for monitoring. The Phragmites has been treated entirely here. Farther out on the spit is the Long Point National Wildlife Area. We have treated about 225 hectares here through this year. And again, a couple areas that have been not managed yet due to our monitoring, but those should be hit next year. What we have yet to do, I'll get into in a moment, is the very farthest unit of the National Wildlife Area, the Long Point unit. We have great results so far from our environmental monitoring. Um, And some of this has been published, and Courtney may talk about it. And these results are not just for the National Wildlife Area projects, but for the entire region's program. There's been more than 95% efficacy of this work 4 years after management. So in the upper right-hand corner, you can see an area that's been treated versus an area that was a control plot. So 4 years later, if there's frag, there's still frag, but the treated areas are by and large remaining frag-free. There's open water and hemi-marsh conditions returning. We are seeing a transition in native diversity increasing. And importantly for the Canadian Wildlife Service, we're seeing species of SAR vegetation recover. So things like horsetail spike rush and bent spike rush, and culturally significant species like wild rice have been observed in areas where they have not been observed before. So those sort of take-homes are really important in terms of demonstrating that our objectives are being achieved by this work. We also did an exercise where we were looking at the conversion of Phragmites habitat to open water, which is important for fish habitat and submerged aquatic species. We're seeing benefits to species at risk like Fowler's toad, least bittern, and SAR turtles as a result of this work. Removing the Phragmites, managing and then removing the Phragmites creates open water habitat. It creates habitat for breeding, decreases shading so that new vegetation can establish. And of course, importantly for turtles, it reduces barriers to movement. And important for our partners was looking at this effects of the herbicide and surfactant in water and sediment, as well as demonstrating surface water safety. And the image on the left is where we took samples of surface water. It's near an intake area. And so, we needed to be very sure that the addition of this herbicide into this wetland area wasn't going to get into drinking water. And what we found was that our surface water samples have never approached the Ontario drinking water quality standards. So it's always been a safe application of herbicide. And then our herbicide and surfactant levels in both the water and sediment have always been well below the ecological thresholds of concern. And so we're demonstrating in detail that the application of the herbicide at label rates is safe, effective, and is not damaging to the ecosystem. So in terms of next steps, now approximately 1,600 hectares have been treated across the Long Point region. As you see on this map, there are some dots of yellow. Most of these are in association with our control and reference sites on the national wildlife areas, as well as this big, large unit known as the Long Point unit, which is, of course, exceedingly difficult to access and quite remote. And we do hope to treat this area this coming year. The Canadian Wildlife Service has applied once again for an emergency registration to use the herbicide glyphosate or Roundup Custom to do this work. If it's approved, we will be treating, we should be able to complete treatment in all of this area using a helicopter as well as ground contractors to do the work. If we do not get that emergency registration, we now have the opportunity in Canada to use the herbicide Habitat Aqua, which is as an imazapyr-based product. And we will use that, but do not think that we'll be able to complete treatment of the entire unit with that herbicide. So our partners elsewhere in the Long Point region, if they have new areas of Phragmites that need to be managed, they likely will be using Habitat Aqua to do that work. So I wanted to get into some lessons learned, and I think in terms of the collaborative spirit of those of us who work in invasive species, I really do hope that we can work more closely together, particularly as Habitat Aqua now is licensed, so there is a legal herbicide, a registered herbicide. The Phragmites is expanding across the country,
Just
and
5 minutes.
so okay. So to summarize then, if you are going to do a Phragmites management project, I advise everyone to contact somebody else who's done a project, an expert, to discuss your work, and then to figure out what is the right best management practice for you, because you don't always need to use herbicides. There are other practices available, but you do need to choose what's right for you and for your capacity. Um, Engage your neighbors, because if you're managing Phragmites on your property, but you do not have management on an adjacent property, it's just going to come right back to bite you. Um, Establish objectives. So for us, it was species at risk and habitat for wildlife, and we're monitoring that to ensure that we're having an impact on those. So take stock of what your objectives are and what you hope to achieve from your work, and be able to determine whether or not that's coming through. Be prepared for a long-term commitment, and I definitely advise anyone who's starting work to not start it unless they plan to do it for a very long time. It can be an expensive um, process. Um, and if you're not able, like, don't start until you really have a thoughtful and laid out plan. If you are using herbicides, and even if you're not, expect that there's going to be pushback, and be prepared to listen and advocate or support your project. And that means you need to become an expert, particularly if you're using herbicides. Always have a backup plan, because you will need it. There's always something. I'm shocked every year that there's always something that goes wrong, and we have to sort of make a pivot at the last minute to get our work done. And then always work to the highest standard. And as a federal employee, this is expected of me, but I assume that everyone else does this as well. But particularly if you're working with herbicides, you need to work with the utmost integrity, um, and make sure that you're fully aware of the impact that you could be having should it not happen correctly. For implementation, I do recommend that people think about the species that are in the areas that they're managing. And so for us, that meant that we did a risk assessment so that we could implement Phragmites management to avoid critical life cycle stages. And fortunately, the best time to manage frag is in the fall. And that also coincides with when many species have migrated or senesced. Um, in this map, you'll see we have located some species at risk, and we put a buffer around those. And so they would not be, they were areas to avoid by our contractors. Um, we do work only with experienced contractors. We use clean equipment protocol. If we CSR, we stop, we avoid it. We think about the types of management that we're doing, and whether the use of the use of a marsh master with a blade maybe could impact. What would happen if that blade came in contact with a turtle? We don't want to do that, so we use a different approach. But I advise people to think about what might be there, and what you might not want to manage. For herbicide application, again, this is new in Canada, and when people start using herbicides, mistakes can happen. And I saw this throughout the US with, you know, federal parks agencies, researchers making mistakes when mixing herbicides and applying herbicides at rates far greater than are legally allowed. And so I recommend anyone who endeavors to use herbicide, you need to talk to an expert. You need to have expert contractors who are licensed and know how to manage herbicides, know how to apply herbicides appropriately. I also suggest you have mapping to the best of your ability. Mapping is probably like the unsung victim here. There's never going to be perfect mapping, but suggest that you do your best to find and do that exploration beforehand. Avoid impacts to plants, fish, and wildlife when possible. Again, for federal lands, this is of the utmost importance. But I do think folks should think of it before they work on their own land. And then again, fully be able to distinguish between invasive and native Phragmites. So again, in Ontario, this partnership was really successful because of the regional collaboration, all of these entities working together. And what I am hoping and bringing to the table is that as we continue to work across Canada, that we look for opportunities to work together to learn from each other. So we're not all recreating the wheel as we pursue Phragmites management. So I apologize if I went over today, but my contact information is on the screen. I am psyched to have discussions with people to talk about opportunities for partnership, lessons learned, sharing, and yeah, just being part of the overall Canadian Phragmites management and restoration community. So thank you.